Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have a fantastic chat with Brian Miner for you to enjoy. We're talking about his 2017 prep, and this is a bit of an extension of the chat that we've had about being ready too early, where Brian was effectively ready early, but that led to a better physique overall, and we talk about a metabolic building phase that he used during this prep to look his absolute best. As always, guys, really enjoy this episode. And as a reminder, we do have our own contest prep ebook that we did along with the guys at JPS. And this does cover this phase and a lot of the things that we're talking about here. So if you want a deeper dive into it, I would highly recommend checking that out too. But without further ado, let's get into this chat because it was a great one. Enjoy. Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Brian Miner back on the show. I think Brian was last on for a refeed roundtable, and this time we're talking more bodybuilding stuff. And Brian is a natural pro bodybuilder, very, very good one at that. And we're actually going to be discussing something that actually happened in his last prep, and that was related to the topic that we covered with Andrew Chappelle and Alberto Nunez about being kind of ready too early, or as Alberto Nunez was talking about it, like he sees this as the new way that people are going to be peaking. And it kind of comes back to, I think, Dr. Joe, and where he was kind of taking people through this metabolic building phase where people are already kind of essentially stage ready, and then you're kind of eating them up into shows almost. And this was something Brian has experience with personally. And actually, I think it was Alberto reached out to me after we recorded that podcast and sent me the post of Brian's where he had kind of a before and after of the metabolic building phase. And I was like, oh, I've actually liked it and commented on it. So it was a while ago. And I was like, oh, this is a really good, like, for me, a memory of what Brian has done. And so that's what led me to want to bring Brian on to kind of discuss it a little bit further, because I think this is one of those things, it's like kind of minutia, but I think this was also quite an important topic, because I think some people get to this position and they're almost lost and they don't have the tools of how to get out of it or to make the most out of this situation. And then, I mean, some people never get there because they don't quite hit the mark or don't get lean enough, which is also another topic in its own right. But I thought it'll be just great to dig into Brian's brain of how you went about it, how you got into it, what was your process behind it. So I don't know if you want to start off with like how you started your prep, because I guess you probably somewhat planned to do this because you are an experienced competitor, which must help a ton.
Yeah. Having Berto, nearby is like a sounding board to kind of help was, that was super advantageous, because I think anybody who's prepping, like the easy thing to do is to like press the gas pedal harder in times where you should probably back off. And so that he was a good voice of reason there. But one thing that I think, the guys at 3DMJ have really done a great job of is, getting people to plan further in advance for these preps. And, I think part of that sort of weeds out the people that may not want to go down this hole in terms of a contest prep, because it's not something that, I mean, you see guys and, gals at the highest level, like this isn't something they decided to do. Like, okay, I'm, 12 weeks out, like, I think I want to do a show, and they end up, on the pro stage in ridiculous shape. I'm sure there's some exceptions to that, but for the most part, I think, the message of planning well in advance is something that has benefited the community substantially. And so for me, I think in the last off season, so just to kind of give some idea, like I competed in 2017, my last prep, which it's been a while. I competed, I think, anywhere between like 177 and 180, depending on, the show. So mid to high 170s. And, I had taken a 5-year off season. So it was a substantial amount of time. And I think my peak off season weight was right around like 217, maybe. So like I got up there. I think I'm actually curious if I crunch the numbers here percentage wise, just to, so yeah, I was like 18% above stage weight. And I think for extended off seasons, I mean, for me, that's, it was a nice balance. Like I could perform well in the gym, I was getting stronger. I was competing in powerlifting at the time. And so it was, a nice sort of pocket to be in terms of, weight range. And I would kind of, cut up and down between like, 12, 15% over back up to 18, kind of rinse and repeat with mini cuts. And I was competing like in the 93 kilo class, which is like 205 pounds. So, in order to make weight for that, I would need to get down to about like 210, 212, and then like manipulate water, just water load and make weight. So, I was training for the majority of this season, once I kind of came out of the previous prep, like above my competing weight for powerlifting as well. But point being is I decided,
Right.
like I had done the Arnold Classic a few times in that time period, the powerlifting meet they had there. And I competed the 93 kilos there, but heading into 2017. So like my initial stages of fat loss actually started in, I think it was late 2016. So I went down, basically cut from, the mid teens and, 215, 217 down to about 10% over stage weight. So for me, that was like mid 190s, like it was, like knowing like the primary goal, like I qualified for the Arnold, but, like I wasn't like a threat to win any, powerlifting meet there. And so I wanted to get that experience, see how I could do competing a little bit lighter, but, compromising some of that strength, knowing that like I was competing light in that weight class. And so, but the plan was the Arnold was in March. So I think around like November, I started dieting, got down to around 195, I think in, like late January, maybe. And then I had like about a month, 6 weeks or so to take a diet break, bring food back up. It may have actually been a little bit longer than that. But basically just chilled at like 195 for a while, and then competed in the Arnold, and then basically started prep right around like formal prep, if we want to call it that, like the main stretch, about 10% over. And that's something that, I know 3DMJ has been a big proponent of, is, kind of breaking it into phases, like this pre-prep fat loss. And I think that, ultimately it all kind of starts looking like that if you get in shape anyway, because like you could go one shot from, 220 or 215 all the way down, but, chances are, most people will, I think in practice, have some, vacation in there, something that sort of disturbs the fat loss process. Like few people have like 8 months to just dedicate to, dieting, or 10 months. And so breaking up the deficit, I think naturally sort of happens to some extent anyway. But, sort of, I think that diet break sort of more than anything, before holding at that 195, just kind of recharged me mentally. And I think that was the biggest benefit. Perhaps there was some subtle metabolic upregulation at that point, but at that point, like I wasn't like extremely lean, like I was still 10% over, so it was, I think the effects of that was more just recharging willpower for the push that was ahead. And so, so at that point, then we started prep, or I started prep, like, I think it was mid-March. It's when the Arnold was, if I remember correctly. And then my first show was in September. So it, during that time, I think I had 1 or 2 diet breaks, because I get a lot of inquiries for people sort of wanting to do this. And this was like one of the worst decisions I've made as an athlete. Like one of the things I wanted to do was compete as an 83 kilo in a powerlifting meet. And so it was on the way down, I competed, and I was like a light 83 at that point. And I think it was in July. I think I was like I think I was like 181 or something like that. And it was rough. Like it was a tough experience. Looked cool. Like, it was cool in that regard, but there's no, unless you're a genetic freak, like your strength is not going to be what it is. And I knew that going in, but it was, it was a unique experience doing that. But, basically I did a diet break, I think, for like a few weeks heading into that, and then, went back into it. So, heading into that first show, just to kind of, all of that was sort of leading up to this discussion of being ready early. Like, I gave myself, plenty of time to lose that last 10%. And I think psychologically that was huge. Like that was one of the best things I could have done for myself. And I mean, it was my third season competing, and, certainly in my first season, the idea, I think the argument, like, should this be a message promoted to, first time competitors being ready early? Like, and it does take, getting truly peeled that early. Like, it takes a certain type of athlete, like a certain level of experience to, be comfortable going to that point. And I think that's, most people acknowledge that, but, I think one thing for first time competitors, getting ready early is going to, I think the stress of feeling like you're behind is like that I think is just as detrimental to the physique as any argument that could be made that, like, okay, you're, holding this is going to, you're going to lose muscle mass. It's like, okay, well, you're still, even if you do, which you shouldn't, if you're, you shouldn't lose much, if any, if you're, managing your nutrition and your training properly. But, just having that looming deadline in the back of your mind when you are a first time competitor, and it's like you in the back of your mind, like, objectively, you may know that you're a little bit behind schedule. Like, that just, it makes you not want to do it again. Like, I think it turns a lot of people off. It's like, I don't want to put that pressure on myself. And for me, like, for especially first time competitors, like, they tend to, grossly underestimate the amount of time it's going to take them to get in contest shape. And so, like, I remember I did an NPC show, my first ever prep. Just, there's like an NPC quote unquote natural show. They had like a polygraph machine that I'm not sure was even plugged in. So it was so there was, I competed at it naturally, but it was a NPC show with the NPC weight classes. And that prep I started, I like perma bulked up to that point, in my career. So I think I started that prep at like 235. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, I might be able to like squeeze into the light heavyweight class. It's like 198, It's like I get to 198 and I'm like looking like, okay, this is clearly, an eye opener. And so I had to, keep pushing. I think I competed at 183 with still about, 10 pounds I could have lost. So, so that was like, at the end of the day, it was a rewarding experience, but it was like an eye opener. Like, okay, planning, like, a lot of people have the kind of that grit to get peeled. They just run out of runway. And I think that's the biggest thing. And I like that the guys like at 3DMJ are really promoting, like, okay, it's better to give yourself a little bit more time than you may need than go right up to and try to just, land perfectly on that date. Like, I think for a lot of people psychologically, that can be pretty challenging.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think you did a great job of at least outlining to people the importance of setting yourself up for success in terms of not having, you can do it. Like you said, you can start 20% plus above the stage weight you're going to have to get to, but that process is going to be quite a bit more painful than if you're a bit closer to the target. You also be able to predict your stage weight a bit better if you're a bit closer, and then kind of holding there for a little period of time. Like you said, even psychologically, enough times I hear that a lot of these things are just psychological. I'm like, well, psychological and physiological are kind of very hard to separate anyway. So I think if it's helping the psychology, there's got to be something physiological that's benefiting from that too. So I really like that. And then in terms of kind of, obviously we talked about it's that process of, if you are ready early, I can see why people get stressed, because they're like, well, I've got like all the condition I need. I'm in this position. What do I do with my like food, nutrition? And I guess the first thing I'd ask is what is the look? Because we're talking about kind of the metabolic building phase. How do you decide when you do that? Like when are you thinking you're peeled enough? Because I think a lot of people probably get to a point where they just keep digging, because it's like there's always more to lose. That's kind of, I don't know, that feels like a phrase that's thrown around, and I think people kind of think that way. And I think with your photos where you had them side by side, it was clear. It was like, well, you're eating more, you're doing less, but you look leaner. And it's kind of like, like what's happening there? So I'd love to hear how you kind of decipher that for an individual.
So that is a really good question. And something that admittedly, you know, especially at the time, like in the position as the athlete, it is a hard thing to do. You know, if you're self-coached, it's a very hard thing to, you know, pull the trigger on. Is, you know, you are pushing for condition, adding food, and pulling back on activity. It just sounds so counterintuitive, you know? So, you know, I leaned a lot on Bert in that situation. You know, he's got quite a bit of experience with this type of scenario. You know, especially now, you know, 4 years later, you know, there's been more opportunity to gather data there. But, you know, in terms of things to look for, I think, you know, I was chronically flat. You know, I was, not that that's, you know, you can be flat and still have fat to lose, but it's almost like, and I think Lyle McDonald actually in one of his books talks about this a little bit. Like when you pinch subcutaneous fat, it almost feels like there's almost like granular, like it feels different than when it's just watery, you know, like there's actual tissue under there rather than just like squishy. Right. So that's like the best way I can kind of describe it. And like if you know, grab, I mean, not you right now, because you're already very lean, but like if you're in the off season and you know, pinch your midsection, like you can tell what's body fat, you know, versus if you pinch like your oblique, you know, which generally carries a little bit less, like it's a different feel for a lot of people. And especially when you're lean, it like your skin doesn't have that, like you can actually pinch something, you know, and it's not just stretchy skin. Yeah. And I think that's,
Hey, Pascal here. I just wanted to take the moment to talk about our membership site. Inside, you'll find a thriving forum, an extensive exercise library, courses, presentations, and research reviews. All I need you to do is hit the link in the description below and sign up.
I think that's one of those things you don't really know until you see it. And if you've been in that position, but yeah, just the feel of where like you carry fat just feels a little bit different. Like it doesn't have that sort of firm, like granular feeling to it, like there is when there's extra fat to lose. But even then, like if you're hypercritical, like you can always find an area where there's some, you know, adipose tissue. It's like there at some point, like you are going to have to make that call if you're doing this and understand like, okay, this is chasing this extra, you know, this ounce of fat in this one location when the rest of my body, you know, is clearly, you know, close to fat free. Like that's not going to be productive. So, I think there is that look. And I think there's that point in prep for, you know, and I'm sure you've probably gone through it at this point where it's like you start to flatten out to the point where it almost looks like you lose condition for a brief point in time. You know, it's like you're getting flatter. So muscle's not pressing up as much against the skin. Like you don't have as much separation and you almost look a little bit more watery. You know, the stress from the whole process, you know, cortisol levels can be significantly higher. You know, you're carrying more water, which is, you know, subcutaneous water, which is sort of exacerbating the fact that you're flat, you know, and so you go through this phase where it's like, you look like you're smaller, but almost gaining, like you're like recomping in the wrong direction for a brief period, you know? And so, but you have to, I think that's where it's important to understand like some of the physiology and the mechanisms of what's actually going on there. Because those parts are tough to navigate as an athlete. Because as soon as maybe you have, a refeed, or, some people have, cheat meals, and they may look significantly better for a brief period of time after that. And they think, okay, like I need more food, like I'm losing muscle. And I think that's that stage where a lot of people fear that they're losing substantial amounts of muscle. And I've just found, like, for me, it just took trusting the process of getting through that, and pushing through that, knowing, okay, once I reintroduce food, things are going to kind of come back to life. I'm going to fill out, some of this, water is going to, this retention is going to dissipate. The diet fatigue is still going to be there. I mean, you're still very lean, but it's going to be mitigated to a substantial degree. So yeah, getting to the point where I think, I spent probably like 4 weeks that were just very, very tough, like in that period where I didn't look very good. Like I just felt very run down. And I think Berto uses the term, like, someone just beat you up in an alley somewhere. It's just kind of, that's how you feel and how you look. Yeah. You just don't have your physique doesn't have any life to it,
Yeah.
So at that point, and I think about, I want to say like 2 weeks out from my first show, because I was pushing fat loss pretty close up to my first show in September, and then I spent, I think, a week gradually getting up to maintenance, a week or two that was, slowly kind of ramping up to maintenance, and I'll get into reasons for that in a minute. But then peak week was still very much like kind of coasting for that first show. Like it wasn't like a traditional like backload or, front load deplete and then, backloading. It wasn't anything. It was like, okay, let's gradually fill out. Let's let some of these issues that have been operating in first gear start to, partially resolve. And, it really was kind of just managing things on a day-to-day basis, trying to get, push more carbs in where I was able to. And if I started to spill, sort of, hold steady or pull back. Cause you should have a general idea of where your maintenance levels are at that point anyway. Just if you could kind of look at the data, the rate of loss. And so I knew that my maintenance was right around, somewhere between like 28 to 3,000 calories. And I was consuming about 2,300 at the end. I guess the other thing to mention is I was doing like 4 low days, 3 high. So it wasn't, and that's something I know the discussion on refeeds, we've already kind of covered that, but I do think, at the end of that prep that made a substantial difference for me. And that's just comparing it to, I've had preps where I would have like 1 cheat meal a week that first show, which like I didn't get lean enough for it anyway. And then second prep, I still got pretty lean in my second prep, but I was doing, I think, refeeds once or twice a week, and I think a lot of people look at refeeds through the lens of, mitigating metabolic adaptation and, mitigating muscle loss. And, there's going to be scenarios where that's probably not going to be the case. If there is a landscape where, at least from the muscle preservation perspective, that it can play a role, it's probably near the end of a prep with someone who's, shredded. So it's, so I think for anything, more than anything, like it started to provide insight into how like I would fill out. So it was like kind of practice for, how efficiently these carbs were sort of starting to get stored, but also, it was a psychological break, and it was a way to start to kind of close the deficit gradually as I got leaner. I think I started at 2 refeeds and then added 3. And I think maybe even at the end, like I started to close, I had like a 4th one, 3 low days. And then eventually all my days were kind of at maintenance. So, and then, I just, at that point, it's kind of based off of look anyway. Right. So, so that helped. I think my training definitely improved once I started adding food back in. I still felt like I looked, like it didn't help much there. I mean, it helped probably more than it felt, to be honest. Like I think, if you look at like the numbers in that post that I made, like it doesn't make sense how I could really be maintaining weight off of that much more calories and that much less physical activity. In fact, I was a little bit lighter. And I think what happens, I think the upregulation in NEAT, like it's not necessarily upregulating it past where it would be in off-season levels, but it's like you're so tanked that any small increase there can help substantially. And I do remember, just feeling, like I could turn my head without it feeling exhausting, like I wasn't slouching as much, and I think those are things like, even if you're keeping steps up, can be things that sort of fly under your radar, where you start to conserve energy, is those types of behaviors.
You start shuffling your feet more than like the spring your step goes. So now you get your spring back.
Yeah. So that I think made a big difference. And then the other thing with weight, when you start to add calories back in, is, on paper, as you store more muscle glycogen, you're going to be storing more intracellular water. And so I think a lot of people will see weight increase when that happens. But I think in this, as long as you do it, and this is where things are a little bit theoretical, if you want to kind of get into the idea of like incrementally increasing food versus like all at once, is that so I think the idea of like, let's say my maintenance calories were 2,800 and I was consuming 2,300, on average, or, on my low days. And then I were to just add 500 calories back in at once, like that's going like, and I would see this with my refeeds. I would see, like, I would look spilled off of, after that first or second day, I would always look a little bit spilled, even though my refeeds were aiming to put me around maintenance. And that always, sometimes that didn't make sense to me. It's like, okay, I shouldn't be spilled if I'm at maintenance, like that. But when you think of it from the perspective of, adding these calories back in, like it could still be your maintenance. And this is where it's a little bit, I'm not totally sure what's going on, but I think there's some evidence that, prolonged exposure to a, lower carb environment, which is sort of inevitable, like lower carbs relative to what you were consuming. Your ability and your efficiency in storing muscle glycogen is going to go down. And so, and this is something I'm working with an athlete right now, Malcolm Cooper, who's, prepping for his first WNBF pro show, the Muscle Mayhem, and he won his pro card earlier this year. But that's one thing with him. Malcolm. Like
I'm trying to think.
I think you do follow him. I've seen
his name on Instagram is Strength.
Like Strength and
I know Malcolm. I know he's
Strength School and in.
Yeah.
I always thought that was like a play on the Jersey Shore, like the gym, tan, and laundry. Like it's because it says like strength, tan, and in. Like, what is it? He finally felt like an idiot once he told me. But so he's somebody where we've had to, I think, just naturally things get down to like his NEAT levels. Like even if his activity's high, I think when he's sedentary, he's like sedentary. Like
he's dead.
It's something where, I think we've had to get pretty aggressive with him. But I've noticed when we fill him out, like if I were throw, a refeed at him, that's sort of aggressive, it's almost like he looks flat still, but he's also more watery. And I think this is something like that's
I've seen
a lot of athletes experience where, and it kind of makes sense if you consider like, okay, your capacity for glycogen storage is your skeletal muscle. Like the more skeletal muscle you carry, the more glycogen you can, store. It's your fuel tank essentially. But your ability and your efficiency of filling that, and I guess if you want to use the term like assimilating these carbohydrates as they come in, can be the rate limiting factor there. And so, so I think that could sort of explain, and I don't know if that's related, to glycolytic enzymes perhaps being downregulated and needing time to upregulate, or if it's, GLUT4 like that's influencing this, the magnitude of, GLUT4 that's, transporting these carbs. I'm not sure exactly, but I do notice that as for, especially with me and with him, I think we need to be, especially conservative with this, but, I wouldn't, when I started to eat back into the show, I deliberately took sort of slower, like I didn't like tediously increase carbs. Like, okay, I'm going to increase 3 grams this day. It was like, okay, let's do, 100 calories or, 80 calories from carbs, let's increase 20 grams a day. And I think doing that, there's no way of knowing for sure here, but I do feel like it was a smoother transition rather than if I just threw this like bolus of calories in all at once, which, if you do that, then you may look pretty watery at first, especially if you're not efficient at storing those. And that can be misleading. That can make you start to second guess yourself. And so I do think when it comes to, the rate of adding these calories back in this scenario, I do like sort of a somewhat conservative approach. Whereas like with diet breaks, it's like, I would rather just see in the off season, or, I'd rather just see someone go straight to what their estimated maintenance is. But I in this case with him, and with myself, adding these calories back in a little bit slower, I was able to see the benefits once I got to that top end that I may not have been able to see had I just started with that amount. And it doesn't really have anything to do with, metabolic changes. And it wasn't, the strategy wasn't in place because of, trying to upregulate metabolism. It was just like, okay, I want to get my body sort of used to this new amount of carbohydrate.
Yeah.
And so that, like, I speculate that played a role. And I was able to, as I added these carbs back in and started to gradually fill out, stress levels started to come down, extracellular water started to dissipate, or I should say, subcutaneous, not necessarily extracellular, but, I was sort of offsetting. It wasn't that the carbs were pulling water from the sub-Q layer or anything like that, but, where this water was being stored eventually sort of got reallocated. And I think that's why, like in the photos on that post, I was actually a little bit lighter when I looked fuller and leaner, and with substantially more food and less cardio. And so I think ultimately, giving yourself that time, and I don't know if I don't think it needs to be, months necessarily. I think like in Dirk's situation, I've talked with Berto a little bit about that. And, he's already a pretty lean dude, like he's walking around pretty lean even before this. And so, for him, it's probably not as much of like a radical change, and
relatively.
And also like with the unpredictability, listening to the last podcast you did with them, the unpredictability of the show landscape. I've had athletes this year, where shows have been, canceled last minute or even moved up. Like the Muscle Mayhem, I think, was originally supposed to be like 2 weeks later, and they're like, no, we're going to move it up 2 weeks. And so it's like in those cases, that can only stand to help, so he, so Dirk, not everybody is probably going to need to be ready that early. But I think in his case, it's like, I do think it's the right call. Especially if you know the athlete, know their outlook, if they're, dying at that stage, it's one thing to consider. So everybody is going to be a little bit different, but the idea of giving yourself ample time to start to reintroduce carbohydrate, I think is going to help more than it hinders. And I think you're going to be in a better environment for maintaining muscle if you're peeled and eating at maintenance versus if you're dieting right into the show. And, I think people, they associate like maintaining this look with maintaining the deficit, and that's not necessarily the case. It's like you're kind of holding steady. And, from there, like things should really only improve, up to a point. Like I think eventually if your training does start to suffer, like you kind of run out of runway there where it's like, yeah, you may start to lose muscle if training is just in the toilet. But, this helped my training substantially, in hindsight. Like it made a big difference. So yeah, and I think the other thing too, related to the training front, which I feel like doesn't get enough attention when it comes to bodybuilding and prep. It's like, the whole process of programming and prep sometimes ends up being like, okay, do what you comfortably can, get a adequate stimulus and then get out of there. Which I think there's, the chasing performance deep into a prep there's disadvantages to that because, managing expectations, like there's no reason to expect why performance would be improving at that stage. It's like you could bullshit yourself and convince yourself that, you're getting stronger, but chances are like if you're doing additional reps or additional load, like you're probably either working harder or, you're breaking technique in order to log that extra rep in your logbook. So, our leverages change, our technique changes, like, and usually it's in a disadvantageous way, which in a sense can kind of, when you're talking about tension on the muscle, can be a good thing because you can get away with using less load. So I think, as long as you're, doing adequate volume, pushing close enough to failure, most people will be okay, but being strategic with exercise selection and starting to manage the fatigue with, within that variable of exercise selection is pretty important.
Hi guys, Steve here. Just wanted to take a moment of your time to remind you of our online coaching service. At Revive Stronger, we pride ourselves on providing personalized service that will take your physique and knowledge to the next level. If you're interested, check the description and sign up. Amazing. Yeah, I think you said a lot of stuff. Well, you said a lot of stuff and a lot of good stuff as well. I like if I'm framing it where we've started off at a good kind of in reasonable nick in terms of just above 10% above stage weight. You've come down and you've utilized where you had kind of diet breaks due to competing in powerlifting and things, but also kind of slowing your rate of loss via introducing additional refeed days, which again are giving you kind of a bit more data potentially for peaking and what's your carbohydrate tolerance, and to kind of assess. And I think this is going to be the hardest thing for most people, is kind of assessing what is that look that is not, it's not 100% because you need kind of the metabolic building phase or the reintroduction of carbohydrates for that 100%. But that like 95% or so look where you're looking like you can kind of see probably the details you're looking for, but it just all looks a bit washed out and blurry, and the refeeds aren't even giving you the feedback of, oh, when I take a couple of days of refeeding, I look 100%. It's like even those are, something's not quite working right. And I guess that's the point where probably it's the hardest point, and where people aren't calling it, where people are getting burnt by maybe being ready too early, is they're not calling it and they're continuing to push and they just kind of get worse. Whereas the people who, and this, I asked on my Instagram stories, like, where do people lie with this? And there weren't many people who replied, because I don't think too many people get to this position. But there was like starkly people that really did well with it, and other people who really didn't. And I wonder if it's just that point where they can't catch it and it's hard to make that call. And maybe it is something you can do at that position, is like you said, if your training is starting to, like, performance is dropping off, you're starting to feel really like beat up and not great. If you've only got like a month or a few weeks left, is it worth continuing to push, or would you just be better just dialing back? and bringing your physique a bit back to life. And even if you weren't in the position where you're going to get that 100%, but maybe you're still at better than if you were to continue to just drive yourself into the ground.
I don't know if there's really a way to know that without going through it. I mean, I think each prep, competitors should be improving in some way with each prep in terms of strategy. I mean, their physique should be better from the off season, but part of the fun is kind of refining things, as you go. And so you may think like, okay, if you kept pushing and you felt you came in a little too flat, in the example you gave, it's like, okay, next time I know, like, okay, this flatness, or this extra condition didn't really show necessarily because I ended up being a little bit flatter, and then you can kind of refine that look. And so I think it's like, as much as we'd all like to nail our peak 100% of the time with every show, like even the times where we're 98% or 99% or even 95%, it's still data that we can use for subsequent peaks. And I think that's a good outlook to have with this process, because there's a lot of unpredictability until you have that experience of with your physique or with a specific athlete's physique. And so I agree. I think it's one of those things. For me, the hardest part was feeling comfortable making that call to start bringing food back in. And so having somebody that's has a trained eye that's not in your in your position, because we can be our own worst enemy in prep, is certainly helpful. And I have to give Berto a lot of credit for that, because he was a voice of reason there when I was tempted to keep digging and digging. So that was super beneficial. I learned a lot through that. And I think there's things I could have still refined and done a little bit better. But I will say, like, one thing, I was looking back at that post that they made with Dirk, and like some of the comments were, okay, this is not a stress-free experience. Like, this is going to be painful. Having done it and sort of been in a position where, okay, I was behind in my first prep, my second prep, I was, substantially better, by a long shot, but I wasn't at like that truly like elite level of condition quite yet. For at the time, it was pretty good. Like 2012 conditioning versus now, it's like it's crazy how bar keeps getting raised. But I can say, like, in terms of stress and how I felt, I actually, and some may think I'm BSing here, but I felt the most intact, like mentally and physically, at the end of this last prep than I did in the other preps. And I don't know if some of that is, those refeeds maybe mitigating some things like near the end. Like I know there's not a lot of evidence, right now, in very lean bodybuilders, like how these things can impact. But I felt more like hormonally intact as well, things, markers there. And I felt, things just, and some of this could be just the magnitude of the deficit on the way down was just more controlled as well. But I think giving yourself some runway, at least in my experience, and I'm not saying this will be the case for everyone, giving yourself that additional runway, it only benefited me. I didn't really feel like there was really any downside, to be honest, in my personal experience. Not to say that there isn't, there's always going to be pros and cons to everything, but, and I think like Berto would probably say the same thing. Like both of us at the end of that prep were, large proponents of multi-day refeeds. Like it felt like a game changer near the end. And, the role of those changes across a prep, early on, it could just be for psychological reasons and balance and things like that. But, training saw a pretty robust improvement, deeper into prep. And like, perhaps the argument could be made, like if you spread that same deficit across, rather than 4 days across 7, would your training, have suffered as much? Maybe not. Like I don't know the answer to that, but I know having 2 days or 3 days that were substantially higher in intake was at least helped now. Like the psychological part at that point helped significantly. It's like, okay, I've got, 4 days to push. In those first couple days of that, I actually felt decent because I was coming off of 3 refeeds. So it really only felt like 2 days of like difficult prep, each week. And so, so I think psychologically it just helped put me in a position to kind of keep pushing, which I think is sometimes overlooked. It's like, what environment can you place yourself in that's going to allow you to push to the point that you need to, go? Because none of this is in a vacuum. It's our outlook on the situation is going to have a direct impact on how, our behavior. So
for sure. One final question. I know we're close to time.
Oh, you're good.
How, in terms of once we're at that 95% and we're slowly, maybe I don't know if you remove refeeds and just go for an average intake for the week and then start building up. But for that process, regardless, what sort of time period do you think is like, how long is too short? Or I guess as much time as you can have, but how much time? That's kind of what I'm asking.
You're talking about bringing food back up to maintenance.
Yeah.
So I think, and I guess there's some evidence for this. I mean, you look at people like that are carb loading for endurance races. They have this high intake, then they deplete, and then they, reload. And so there's some evidence like this increased intake in the short term can upregulate your ability to store glycogen, once you deplete and then follow back up. So I don't think it's like on a weekly time scale. I think the difference between, a week and 2 weeks is going to be pretty minimal. So for me, I think I personally brought myself back up across, I think like 5 or 7 days. Like it was,
okay.
And when you only have, I mean, if you're in a 400 calorie or 500 calorie average daily deficit, I mean, that comes out to, 25 carbs a day, essentially, or 20 carbs a day across the week. And so it's, it just kind of worked out that way. And at the time, like I'd be lying if I said it was like super calculated or based on anything. It was like, okay, I have a hard time believing like I can only manage these 5 gram increases. Like 20 seems very reasonable. I started there, and then, it didn't take long to close it. And for me, it worked out. And I think as more and more people go about peaking this way, we're going to learn a lot more. Like there's a lot that I've mentioned that I don't know, I just don't know, why it worked necessarily the way it did. I have some speculation, but, this is an area that hasn't really been explored much, even anecdotally at this point, so it's, it's only going to, I guess, get refined from here. But, for me, bringing it up across a week, and like I have a couple athletes. I have one, I have Malcolm, then I have this guy Frederick in Germany, who's like in a really good spot to hit like that 2 week out mark for his first show. And the plan is to like, okay, let's bring you up to maintenance across that week, assess your look, and you want to base it. You still want to, like I say, across a week. But if you add 20 carbs and someone looks like they're not as sharp, it's like, okay, maybe back off and go a little bit more conservative, right. So you still want to be reactionary with it. But, for him, the plan is like, okay, over 2 weeks out, let's bring you up to maintenance. That way we're kind of cruising at, that final week, and we can just make small adjustments each day. And I think the other thing with this is, that makes, I think, some people a little bit apprehensive is it kind of removes some of the utility of some of the traditional peaking methods, because it's like, you're doing this, you're not really front loading if you're already full, and it's like you're like you're at this point, like if you've done it for long enough, if you've been walking around looking stage ready for a couple weeks or, a full week, it's like, is it really worth the gamble to try to get that tiny extra bit, and try to, deplete and then super compensate when you're already very full and, quote unquote, dry looking. So, so for me, like it may be like a subtle front load, maybe, but it's, at that point you're at maintenance. Like you don't really want to put someone in a surplus in peak week either, so it's, so I think that's where like teasing it out, like, can we get any additional, small improvements with manipulations within peak week? And I think there can be areas where you can. I mean, I think, the day of still having like higher sodium intake, in the morning, just to kind of get that, help facilitate a good pump. I mean, I think things like that can make a big difference. But if your point being, like, if you're cruising in, the lack of moving parts on peak week sometimes makes people a little uneasy, and it's like, okay, we're just going to kind of take things day to day. And if you don't have a plan on a spreadsheet, it's like, I can like, I can put you at maintenance numbers on a spreadsheet for the whole week, like if that would help you, and then we'll adjust. But it's like, at that point, it is very reactionary, and I think that's kind of how proper peak should go, really. But I think it's definitely a step away. Exactly, like it's definitely a step away from the conventional way to do it.
Yeah, you've just described exactly how I've peaked this week. I've got a show in a couple of days, and I basically walked my carbs up 400, 450, 500, 550, 600 today. And I'm like, wow, like I'm just looking better. Like this is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But I'm not at the point where you're going to talk about where you transition to basically holding maintenance. I need to go back down to get some more of these glutes in and things like this. So I'm excited.
Well, I mean, it's good to know that this is good data for you to have, because it's like, if you're increasing carbs at this point, in those increments, I mean, if you're looking better every day, then I wouldn't go more conservative. It's like if you can get away with 50 gram increases and look better the next day, like, do it.
Yeah.
So that's great. I'm excited for you, man. Your off season has been, it's been inspiring, because you've made a lot of really impressive progress.
I appreciate
for
that.
someone, you've got a decent amount of training experience under your belt. And I think, just the consistency is, I think in natural bodybuilding, we hear these stats of, these slow rates of muscle growth. And I think sometimes we sort of handicap ourselves into this belief of, okay, I'm only going to gain this much. And, I think when you nail all the variables, like you have, like, we can surprise ourselves. And I think that's very evident. So
I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. Is this a pro qualifier that you have?
This one is just a qualifier for the finals. And then we have a British finals. And then I think if you win that, you go pro. It's super tough in the UK to go pro. Yeah. So the chances
is it the WNBF?
This is the UK DFBA. And then at the moment, we've only got one show for the WNBF. So that's there's no qualifiers. It's just you go in there and that's their pro qualifier. So it all depends who turns up on the day.
Exactly. I mean, that's ultimately, it's like you can only control what you're doing. So it's, and if you empty the tank on this prep, which you're going to, you'll leave content, that's all you can do. So, but yeah, well, I appreciate it, Steve. It was fun. Kind of haven't talked much about that prep in that much detail. So it gives me some stuff to think about too. And I'm excited to see, the bar continue to get raised within this sport, like it has in powerlifting. It's been this exponential rise. And I think that idea of looking over dieted heading into a show, I think this helps sort of get away from that, because you gain back some of that fullness. So, but
fantastic. Brian, I want to say a
appreciate
massive
it.
thank you. It's always a great chat with you, and
Yeah,
I'm glad we
likewise,
managed
man.
to have this. And for the listeners, definitely go check Brian out. I'm going to just say it, BD Miner over on Instagram, and you can go find, if you scroll through, I scroll through, there's loads of posts. I love it when competitors share their prep, because then you can it's like a great resource to go and kind of dig in and see what's going on there. So there is some great stuff there from Brian. And then Myo Journal, I think, is where they should head if they want to get in touch for coaching or anything like that.
Yeah.
I'll make sure that's all linked below so you guys can go check them out. And I appreciate it again, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks a lot, Steve.
So I'm Steve Hall, founder of Revive Stronger and a coach of Revive Stronger.
My name is Pascal Flor. I'm the co-owner of Revive Stronger and also a coach, of course.
Revive Stronger has probably been going solidly for 3 years, roughly about 3 years.
Revive Stronger, to me, it is becoming kind of my child, my foster child. It's the gathering and getting together of like-minded people.
We've been expanding the coaching team, which is helping us help more people, but each coach can only help a certain number of people.
Right now, it's all over the place. We have YouTube, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, but there isn't that community aspect behind that.
And so the next step for us is developing a membership site.
So basically, we want to create a family and a community that is then benefiting from another.
A really cool community for people within our little niche is going to be a website.
They will get early access to our podcast.
You can access us, ask us questions.
The community aspect, we have a forum there. You can ask questions, but also you can log your journey.
There's also going to be courses on there.
Courses, presentations on different topics, discount of past seminar footage. We will log our journey as well. We'll start vlogging.
We're going to have documentaries.
Our entire athletic journey. Furthermore, they get access to an exercise video library.
The exercises that we love for hypertrophy and maximizing hypertrophy, we're going to go through those in depth, telling you how to execute them.
We kept them concise and also mobile friendly so that you can watch them in between your sets.
I'm super excited to grow this community. The amount of value that we're going to be delivering is huge. And I'd love you to be part of it.
You will get so much out of that.
I'll see you inside.